Hi, this is Dr. Chris Clayton with Anjali Ferrara. Thank you for joining us on our 10th episode of Hypnosis Chat. And today we're going to talk about something that I've been working with and thinking about for a long time. Of all the problems that people have that are not physical problems, there's really only two problems. And let me back up for a second. So let's say if someone's afraid of driving, for example, the fact they're afraid of driving is not the problem. That's the symptom. The problem is that they are creating anxiety in their mind and attach that to driving. You could just as easily have that same problem with dogs or public speaking or anything like that. So generally, what most people think of as the problem is really just the symptom. One example of that is depression. The way depression is handled by insurance, it's kind of labeled as a problem, but really depression is not the problem. The problem is anxiety. This is something we've talked about on the show before. So if someone has depression, it always starts with anxiety. You never ask someone, who has depression, are you anxious? And they say, oh no, I'm totally relaxed. I just have depression. You never hear that because that doesn't happen. The depression comes from the anxiety. So anxiety is one of the issues. There's only two issues that people have that are not physical. One is anxiety. The other one is compulsion. And that could be a compulsion to eat foods that you don't want to eat, or compulsions to do various drugs or abuse alcohol, etc. And really it comes down to wanting to do something too much or not wanting to do it, because you're afraid. So, and that pretty much sums up all the issues. Kind of a minor issue also is boredom, which doesn't fall into those two categories, but usually boredom doesn't lead to, it much less frequently leads to really bad consequences. So as far as problems that people have that are, either that really affect their life, it usually just comes down to anxiety or compulsion. So, and those are so what I'd like to do today is kind of talk about those two things. So, and kind of a general approach for solving either one. So why don't you give me, Anjali, think of what is a random problem that people have that I haven't mentioned yet, that is not a physical problem.
Not a physical. You mean an emotional?
Anything could be like
problem?
Yeah.
How
it
about
could
overeating?
Be overeating. Okay, good. So, and obviously that would be in the compulsion category. So, if someone is, it could also be anxiety, where if they eat in order to alleviate the anxiety, or it could be that they are thinking about the taste of the food, or they're imagining the food will be able to increase their enjoyment in some way, and that would be a compulsive issue. So now compulsion is one of the most interesting things the brain does. A lot of people, let's take a drug, for example. We'll take smoking specifically. What makes a smoker? It's not the behavior of smoking, because you can take a non-smoker and force them to smoke a cigarette, but that doesn't make them a smoker. You could take a smoker and take away their cigarettes, but that doesn't make them a non-smoker. So it's not whether or not they're actually smoking. Whether or not you smoke does not define you as a smoker, and that applies to all compulsions. So somebody might say, oh, well, it's if they're addicted to cigarettes. But also, that's not true. You could take someone who you take the body of someone who is a non-smoker and put in the brain of a smoker. Actually, let's do that in reverse first. We'll take the body of a smoker and the brain of a non-smoker, and just don't tell them they smoke at all. And they'll have this weird kind of feeling. It's kind of a slight tension. They won't know what it is because they've never smoked before. And after a few days, it would just go away and they would forget that it ever happened. So, or you could, on the flip side, you can take someone who is a non-smoker's brain, put it a non-smoker's body and put a smoker's brain in there. And at first it'd be like, great, now I don't have to smoke anymore. But the first time something stressful happened, or the first time they thought about cigarettes compulsively, they would start smoking again. So whether or not someone is compelled has nothing to do with what their behavior is or what their physical chemistry is. It has to do with something that I call the compulsion cycle. And the compulsion cycle works like this. It starts with a problem. Now, the problem could be anxiety. It could be whatever it is that, the reason that the person does the thing. Like if someone abuses a medication, whatever that trigger is for that. It starts with that. And then they imagine or consider doing the compulsion, doing the vice. And when you imagine doing something and considering it, it wakes up the part of your brain responsible for compulsion or repulsion. And at that point, it gets taken out of your control. So at least a little bit. So if you, now most things we don't think about compulsively. We don't consider doing them. If I said, do you want to put this piece of paper in your mouth? You would say, no, why would I want to do that? You wouldn't consider it in the sense that you wouldn't imagine what it feels like in your mouth. You wouldn't imagine what it tastes like and think, I wonder if I want to do this. You wouldn't consider it. You would just auto-reject it. So when you consider something, it wakes up the part of your brain responsible for compulsion or repulsion. So that's kind of how the compulsive cycle works. And the only way to eliminate that is to stop it before it gets to that feeling part. So generally compulsion is if you ever do something that you don't want to do or that you want to do less of. So let's see, do you want to give me an example of that, either from yourself or for somebody else?
Example of a compulsion?
Of a compulsion, yeah. Maybe something that you want to do less, or someone who wants to do something less. You can use yourself or not. Either way is fine.
Eating.
Okay, so we're not going
to
we're not going to ask whether or not it's her or someone else. We'll assume it's a friend. So, all right. So the key with compulsion is, with treating compulsion, is that you want to make it so that they have the choice. You can say no or yes. That's the biggest part. It's when it goes out of your control because you're thinking about it in a compulsive way, using that compulsive cycle of thinking, that it is a problem. So let's do this. What is an example? We'll just pretend like it's you that we're talking about for a second. So what is an example of a food that you might feel compelled to eat?
Chocolate.
Okay, clearly we're talking about somebody else, maybe a friend of hers.
Clearly.
So just pretend like you're the friend for a second. Okay, so all right, now, so and viewers at home, maybe you know someone that also is compelled to eat chocolate. So if you know someone, maybe think about that person. So, all right, so now we're going to try the two different ways, the compulsive way and the non-compulsive way. By the way, our society does not teach us how to use our brain on purpose. There's different types of society across the world. In some countries, especially in the East, they take controlling your mind very seriously. Here, we don't do that. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but in America, it's more, here's what you need to do, figure it out. Now, there's some advantages to that. It does create more of an independence, and we see that in American culture. But the problem is, if you don't figure it out, no one teaches you. So learning, it's good to have both, a little bit of this, figure it out yourself, and also let's think of the tools and understand how to figure something out in the best way. So let's do the compulsive way first. So let's just say that now this person that you're thinking of, when would they usually have chocolate? When they're stressed or hungry or bored or what?
Actually, all the above.
All of the above. Okay,
My
so
senses
good.
tell me.
Your senses tell you that's all the above. Okay, so now really the key thing with making something compulsive or not compulsive is now think of something else that other people are compelled to do that you and your friends have no interest in, like a drug or something that you just have no interest in, or even a food that you don't really like.
Interesting.
You got something like that? Like, I don't particularly like lemon cupcakes, for example. They don't do it for me. So now when I think about that, or beer, yeah, we're not big beer drinkers. So beer is an example. Beer is something that I think about intellectually. I know what it looks like. See, it really gets into how we think about things. Of the senses that we think with, visual and auditory are the intellectual senses. When you think about something intellectually, you see what it looks like, and you maybe say the name of it or you think of a definition or something like that. Those are the intellectual senses. The other senses, feeling, tasting, and smelling, are the experiential senses. So when you think about, so if I say think about beer, I think about it visually. Like I can just see what it looks like, and maybe auditorily, maybe a type of beer or just the word beer or whatever. What I don't do is imagine it being cold and refreshing and drinking it and things like that in the way that I might with like my favorite, mixed like powder drink, like Crystal Light or something like that. So I think about them very differently. I think about something that I'm used to, but I could do it the other way. I could think about beer in that way, which I did for a second, just to figure out how to do that. I could think about that, and then it wakes up the part of your brain responsible for compulsion or repulsion. Could be either one. So I could be repelled against beer if I think about it a certain way, or I could be compelled if I think about it a different way. So, but the key is if you think about it intellectually, i.e. not in a feeling way or smelling or tasting way, in a non-experiential way, that part of your brain doesn't wake up, so you're in full control. So if you feel like you're controlled by something, you're not really controlled. You are thinking about it in an experiential way, which is waking up that part of your brain, which is taking control away from your conscious mind. So, for example, okay, so let's go back to chocolate. So if we think about chocolate and what it tastes like, feels like, and smells like, that is experiential, and it wakes up the experiential part of your brain. Does that make sense? On the other hand, you just clear your mind, get rid of all that. And if you just think about what it looks like, it's like seeing what it looks like on the counter and maybe hearing the name of it, that's not experiential. That's that's just information. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So now people who are not compelled by chocolate, even if they like it, it's not like they think about it compulsively and then they resist it. Generally, if someone just has no problem eating too much chocolate or anything, they think about it in the intellectual way. And even if they might like the taste of it, they're not in the habit of thinking about it in the tasting way. Okay, so does that make sense? And a lot of stuff that we do has to do with that. What is the first thing you think of when you think of a thing? If I say dog, do you like dogs? If the first thing you think of is a dog, petting a dog, normal dog things, enjoying the company of a dog, then you're going to like dogs. Whether you like dogs or not is just a reflection of the initial impression that you have, that you're programmed or you're used to thinking about whenever someone mentions dog or the idea of dog comes in. It's just like a lens. So if my lens for dog is holding my own dogs and petting them while they go to sleep in my arms, that's going to lead to a certain feeling. And that's the lens through which I'm going to see all dogs. Now, after it goes through that lens, I can make distinctions based on what dog is, but that's where it starts. That's the starting point. Likewise with compulsions. If you think about, if someone says, would you like chocolate? And you immediately go to the taste, then that's going to be the lens you see it through, and everything else is going to sort of revolve around that. That's where it starts. And then, the acorn doesn't fall far from the tree. So, you might think about it a little differently, but it's always going to start with that. What does it taste like? It could also be, what does it feel like? What does it feel like? Or even, what does it smell like? Also, you could associate it with relaxing or something like that, dealing with stress, which it doesn't do at all. But we sometimes have these false associations which alter our behavior. So, okay, so that is so there's sort of the compulsive way and the non-compulsive way. Again, the compulsive way would be imagining the experience of it, which is tasting, feeling, which you don't have to do. Whereas the intellectual way, the non-compulsive way, is where you are either seeing it or hearing it in the same way that you would think about something that is not compulsive.
So smelling it would be obviously the...
Right, and that's not going to be a huge thing.
Yeah,
but for that in particular, but it could be like, baked goods, smelling baked goods in the store or whatever. Could you do me a favor and turn that fan on, please?
Sure.
Thank you very much. So essentially, if you have a compulsion to something and you don't want to, identify how you're thinking about it. We don't usually think about how we think, our patterns of thinking. So okay, oh, I want chocolate and I don't want to. So what is the, how am I thinking about it? Oh, well, I'm imagining what it tastes like immediately. Now, you don't have to do that. That's not something that you have to do. Just because you're used to something doesn't mean that's the true way to do it. You can do it any way you want just as easily. It's just a matter, just like if you're used to flipping a light on whenever you walk into the room. You don't have to do that, even if you're used to doing it. It just takes the decision to not do it. And then you just have to kind of pay attention to your behavior until you get used to it. So that's sort of the quick and dirty way to change behavior. Of course, hypnosis helps make that process much more efficient and permanent, but you can do it through extensive practice and paying attention also. Okay, so that's sort of the long and short about compulsion. So if you feel compelled, you can follow that formula. You can switch it to a more intellectual way of thinking. There's lots of stuff. In fact, most things we think about intellectually. We don't think about most things in the experiential way. We think about most things by what they look like or what sounds they make or what words are associated with them. Okay, so the other half of what I want to talk about is compulsions. Is anxiety. So anxiety can cause basically three things to happen. Your brain responds in about three different ways to too much anxiety, and those ways are symptoms. They're not the problem. The problem is generating too much anxiety. In fact, things like depression is not a problem. Depression is a defense mechanism. Depression is your body attempting to save you from having too much anxiety. So we'll talk about that in more detail in a second. Depression is not the problem. Bipolar disorder is not the problem. Mania or too much anxiety is not the problem. The problem is generating the anxiety in the first place. So some people are, okay, so one of the ways of dealing with it, which is probably the least common, is to just be manic and just try to expend this energy as quickly as possible, because being anxious generates energy. And if you keep doing that, and if you don't have any other way of dealing with it, just getting it out, people who like yell and scream, obviously not socially acceptable. So that tends to get called out. So that's why that's kind of the least common. Those are the ones that the society would label as the most crazy. And so, because that's not a useful response, not that the other ones are super useful, but people tend to unconsciously veer away from that. So just straight mania. The other one is, or the next one would be bipolar disorder, where someone has a lot of anxiety and they become manic, and the body's like, okay, we need to shut down for a little while. We can't keep doing this manic stuff. They're going to think we're crazy, or it's going to break down the body, or both, or whatever. So unconsciously, you kind of shut down. But the problem never gets solved, and the anxiety keeps building until the anxiety wins over again. It could be a couple weeks later, it could be a couple months later, and then it's back. And then there's this cycle where it's exploding and forcibly shutting down, exploding and forcibly shutting down. So again, the problem is not the bipolar disorder. The bipolar disorder is an effort to deal with the excess anxiety. And then the third one, which might be the most common, is depression. Depression is where the body just kind of shuts down and it stays down. And the main difference between depression and bipolar is that you're unconscious, your brain never lets you get to that manic stage. It just keeps you down. And that's why it still has the same cycle. People who are depressed, if you notice, still have that same up and down cycle, but the up is not as high. The up is more normalized. And then once it starts getting a little too anxious, the brain shuts down sooner, as opposed to letting it get way too high in bipolar disorder. So, okay, so does all that make sense? So that's a good, that's basically the three ways that your brain deals with excess anxiety. Of course, there's normalized way of dealing with anxiety. Most people have the ability to manage anxiety within normal social means, to the point where it's not, they're not labeled as having a mental health disorder or cause any significant trouble, even though they might live with a substantial amount of anxiety. That's the other advantage of depression. It tends to not get you in trouble. It tends to be the most functional of the ways of dealing with anxiety, even though with chronic depression, it can become very non-functional. So, and which is probably why the fact that it's higher functioning than the other ways is probably why more people have depression than bipolar disorder and just straight mania. So, okay. So that's essentially how the brain attempts to deal with anxiety. So now the problem is you're still generating the anxiety. If you don't stop generating the anxiety, your body will have to use these not so good means of trying to deal with it. But it's better than just your body breaking down because you just hold the anxiety in all the time and you're constantly generating anxiety and have no vent for it, and you just have a heart attack. That's what would happen if we didn't have any. That's why these things are protective mechanisms. Even the mania is a protective mechanism, because if you just kept all that anxiety in and kept building it up, you would have a heart attack or something. Something would happen where you would, there would be some detrimental thing that happens. Okay, so the key is, and the only real solution is to, rather than use this style of thinking where you're constantly generating energy, you instead have to be able to manage that correctly. And we could talk about this for days and weeks. For now, I'm just going to go over the basics on dealing with anxiety. One of the first thing to remember, just like with compulsions, is that it comes from your mind. You're the one creating the anxiety. The world is not giving it to you. And that's good news, because since it's your responsibility, it's also within your power to change. I would always prefer something to be my responsibility and my power than someone else's responsibility and no power on my part. I'd always rather take responsibility for something and then have the power to change it. And that is the case with both compulsions and anxiety. So in this case, very generally, an anxiety-producing style of thinking is problem-oriented. So, for example, if, let's say, a problem is you have anxiety about social events. If you think about social events and you imagine, you not doing well or failing at those events, and then if you, at that point, if you focus on the problem, like, well, if I keep doing that, I won't be able to go to any social events. It'll also hurt my work. If you focus on the problem, your brain is supposed to create anxiety. There's nothing wrong with you, with your brain, if you are using an anxiety-producing style of thinking and your brain produces anxiety. Your brain is doing exactly what it's supposed to because it works perfectly fine. You're just giving it instructions that are not the most useful for your life. Okay, does that make sense? That's an important point, because a lot of people think there's something wrong with them because they have behaviors that don't match up with what society tells them to do. So on the other hand, people who don't have a lot of anxiety tend to have a more solution or action-oriented style of thinking. So for example, if the issue is, let's say again, social anxiety, and the nice thing is there's lots and lots of different kinds of solutions. It could be, well, maybe I'll work on it in smaller groups and I'll work my way up to it. Some people have the tendency to say, oh, well, I don't think I could even do that, because then they go back into problem oriented. They're not going to be able to solve their problem because they're stuck in this habit of always leaning toward the problem rather than leaning toward the solution. The number one thing that you can do for yourself related to anxiety is get in the habit of leaning toward a solution. So if that's the situation for you and you think to yourself, okay, well, maybe I'll practice in smaller groups, rather than going toward I wouldn't even do well in smaller groups, just go in the other direction of, okay, well, maybe I can do well in small groups, or maybe I'll just make it one-on-one or one-on-two, and then I'll work on it from there. Now, that may or may not be the best solution, but because you're thinking in a solution-oriented way, it generates less anxiety. Okay, so let me explain that in a different way. Just the fact that you're attempting to get a solution decreases anxiety. The actual solution that you come up with is secondary. It's just like, if your young son or daughter came out and, oh, there's a monster under the bed. Of course, you wouldn't say, if the monster gets you, you won't be able to go to school tomorrow. Yeah, of course, no, you wouldn't say that. We just know better when we're talking to other people. But that's the sort of thing we say to ourselves, right? We say that to ourselves all the time. Oh, well, if I can't pay this bill, this will happen. Oh, if I can't do this, or if I get into a social event, I won't be able to do this. We say things that we would never say to another person to ourselves all the time. And when I say to yourselves, it's to your brain, it's to your unconscious. Your unconscious is just kind of like the child that is afraid of something. And the way you talk to yourself can influence whether or not, and it can actually determine whether or not you feel confidence or anxiety. So, if your child, you might say, oh, well, you could say almost anything in a solution-oriented way. Oh, well, here's a magic book. I'll put this in your room and that keeps the monsters away. Or, oh, we'll go check under the bed and see if it's there. Or, oh, I'll give you this thing, or I'll read you a story, or whatever. The actual solution is not that important. What's important is that you are acting in a solution-oriented way, and that builds confidence in the child. The child's like, okay, he's doing something. He's got it handled. Okay, now, and that's much better than worrying. If you were to worry about the problem too, then that just doubles their worry. Like, oh, wow, he can't even handle this monster under the bed, right? So instead, do something that is solution-oriented. It should be not just solution-oriented, but action-oriented. You should be doing something about it. And that comforts your brain in the same way that it comforts the child. So if you get the best way to handle anxiety is to get in the habit of being a solution-oriented person who's like, okay, what is a solution for this? That's a good question you can ask yourself just to move yourself in the right direction. What is the best course of action for the current problem or goal? And then brainstorm. And again, it almost doesn't matter what solution you come up with as far as the anxiety is concerned, because you're being solution oriented, you're being action oriented. That comforts your brain. And as a nice benefit, it also helps you come up with better solutions.
Should you tell the child, well, monsters, or you could say something like, if you do your homework, the monster won't show up. The monster doesn't like smart people.
It doesn't like the taste of smart people.
Yes, I'm offering a solution. I've been thinking about this for a minute.
That was good. That's definitely better than the other examples. Creative problem solving. Monster, did you know that monsters are attracted to dirty rooms? Monsters love messy rooms because there's so many places to hide. Okay, no, none of these are recommended. Don't do any of this. Okay, anyway, on that note, I think it's about time to call it a day. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you very much, as always. And I will look forward to see everyone next week for episode 11. Take care.